On the day Sunday Awoniyi was born, nobody would have guessed his life would end with strangers whispering his name in government corridors, as if it were a password. Yet that is exactly what happened. Here's the contrast that should not exist in one human story. A boy from a modest corner of Nigeria, growing up under the long shadow of colonial rule, would one day sit close enough to the very heart of power that a single decision, his or his rivals, could tilt entire careers. And the terrifying part? He wouldn't have unlimited time to get there. He would have a clock ticking over his head for years, a deadline he did not choose, a window that could slam shut at any moment. He came into the world on April 30th, 1932, in what was then northern Nigeria, an era when your future was often decided before you could even spell your own name. The country around him was not yet a country in the way people later learned to say it. It was a patchwork under foreign administration, with borders drawn like quick cuts on a map. To grow up in that world meant learning two languages at once: the language of your home, its expectations, its elders, its survival, and the language of authority, rules, institutions, uniforms, documents, offices. Sunday's childhood did not come with the soft cushion of certainty. Nigeria in the 1930s and 1940s was a place where education could feel like a miracle and a weapon at the same time. If you got schooling, you were lucky. If you did well, you became dangerous in the best possible way, because literacy, organization, and confidence were exactly what colonial systems feared and what future nation builders needed. Sunday Awoniyi grew up watching that tension play out in real life. The silent pressure to stay in your lane and the stubborn desire to step out of it. People who later met him in politics often described him with the same pair of words, spoken like a warning and a compliment in one breath: disciplined and strategic. That didn't appear overnight. It was built in those early years, in a social environment where respect mattered, where listening carefully could save you, and where ambition had to wear the mask of humility just to survive. As he moved from boyhood into adolescence, Nigeria itself began to shift under everyone's feet. The air carried new sounds: debates about self-rule, arguments over regions, questions about what kind of nation could be stitched from so many identities. For a young man with sharp instincts, this wasn't just politics. It was destiny being negotiated in public. Sunday Awoniyi's path into public life was not a straight line. It never is for people who become influential without being born into the highest circles. You don't just walk through the front door. You learn the building, the guards, the side entrances, the paperwork, the hierarchy. You learn which conversations matter and which ones are traps. And you learn something else, something colder. The people who rise are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones who understand timing. That idea, timing, would become a quiet obsession in his life. Because as Nigeria moved toward independence, the political world was filling up fast. Too many hungry minds, too many would-be leaders, too many men who could speak beautifully, rally crowds, deliver slogans. The competition wasn't going to be a friendly foot race. It would be more like a fight for oxygen in a room that kept shrinking. And somewhere in that tightening space, Sunday Awoniyi discovered the central conflict that would define his early climb. There was always a competitor, always another man reaching for the same opening, the same appointment, the same influence, the same trust. In this first act of his life, that competitor was not yet a famous name carved into history books. It was someone close enough to share rooms, to hear the same rumors, to chase the same opportunities. Someone who understood the same rules of the game. Let's call him what he felt like in those years: the rival. A man with similar ambition, similar hunger, but a different style. More flamboyant, more visible, more willing to burn bridges to get ahead faster. Where Sunday leaned toward careful strategy, the rival leaned toward spectacle. And spectacle can be seductive in politics. It can also be deadly. Sunday's entry into the political arena came through service, through building credibility in environments where trust is currency, and mistakes are not forgiven. This is the part people often skip in biographies because it's not glamorous. Meetings, memos, protocols, administrative discipline. But that's exactly where power's manufactured. While others were chasing microphones, he was learning how decisions actually moved. Who signed what? Who called whom? Which words in a document could change the meaning of an entire policy? At the same time, Nigeria was approaching its great turning point. The march toward independence was not one clean, heroic story. It was a storm of competing interests. Regional politics hardened. Alliances formed and fractured. Men smiled in daylight and negotiated in shadows. The closer the country got to full self-rule, the more the stakes rose. Everyone wanted a seat at the new table. Everyone was terrified of being left behind when the door closed. And this is where the ticking clock enters the story more sharply. Because in a transitional era, opportunities don't last long. A window opens, then slams shut. A political structure appears, then collapses. A leader rises, then falls. To make yourself indispensable, you have to step in at precisely the right moment. Too early and you're crushed. Too late and you're irrelevant. Sunday Awoniyi understood that. He watched older figures maneuver, watched careers flare up like matches and die just as quickly. He learned that influence is often built not by the ones who shout the loudest, but by the ones who can be trusted when the room turns tense. And the room was always turning tense. But while he was building his footing, the rival was building something else. A reputation for speed, for skipping steps, for knowing people. And for a while it worked. The rival would arrive where Sunday wanted to be, just a little earlier. Shake the hand first, sit in the chair first, speak to the right person first. It's the most infuriating kind of competition because it doesn't feel like you're losing to skill. It feels like you're losing to audacity. There is a particular humiliation that comes when you know you're capable, you know you're disciplined, and yet someone else keeps taking the spotlight. That humiliation either breaks you or sharpens you. In Sunday's case, it sharpened him into something more focused. If the rival wanted to win by spectacle, Sunday would win by becoming essential. As Nigeria crossed into independence in 1960, the promise was electric. But the fear was just as real. Because the moment a nation is born, it immediately has to decide who controls it. And those decisions rarely happen cleanly. The early post-independence years were filled with political tension, regional rivalry, and the growing sense that the young country was balancing on a knife edge. In that atmosphere, Sunday Awoniyi continued his steady ascent through public roles and political involvement, positioning himself not as a temporary loud voice, but as a person who could operate in serious systems. You could feel the country's heartbeat in the background. Elections, crises, accusations, alliances. Every newspaper headline was a signal. The rules are still being written. And then, like an unexpected crack of thunder, Nigeria's politics took a darker turn. Instability escalated. The nation's leadership struggled under pressure. The military began to loom larger, like a shadow creeping across the wall. People who were building political careers suddenly realized they weren't just competing with each other anymore. They were competing with history itself. For Sunday, the rival was still there, still circling the same opportunities. But now the stakes were changing. It wasn't only about who got ahead. It was about who survived the coming storms, who remained relevant when the ground shifted, who could navigate a system that might flip overnight from civilian politics to military influence. And the rival made a crucial mistake, one that becomes clear only in hindsight. He believed speed would always beat strategy. He believed visibility would always beat trust. He believed the game would remain the same. Sunday Awoniyi did not. He began to understand that Nigeria's next chapter would reward a different kind of political operator, someone who could function in both formal and informal networks, someone who could keep relationships intact across changing regimes, someone who knew how to be present without being reckless. But here's the twist that makes this first part of his story feel like a thriller rather than a simple biography. Sunday wasn't simply climbing. He was also being tested. In volatile political environments, people don't just watch what you do. They watch what you refuse to do. They watch whether you panic. They watch whether you betray. They watch whether you can hold your tongue when it would be easier to speak. And in that testing, the rival tried to corner him, not with violence, not with open war, but with something subtler, narrative. The rival started spreading the kind of rumor that can kill a career before it becomes visible. Suggestions that Sunday was too cautious, that he lacked the charisma for higher roles, that he would never be chosen when decisive moments came. It was psychological warfare dressed up as casual political talk. Sunday's response wasn't to fight the rumor with louder rumor. He fought it with something far more dangerous. Consistency, reliability, the slow accumulation of trust from people who mattered. Because here's a fact that sounds simple until you see it up close. In government and political structures, a single person's trust can become a ladder. If one influential figure decides you are dependable, they begin to pull you into rooms you didn't even know existed. And once you are in those rooms, your name starts to travel. Sunday Awoniyi's name began to travel, not as a showman, as a serious person, and that scared the rival. By the late 1960s, Nigeria had entered years that would scar its political memory. Conflict, upheaval, the sense that the nation's experiment was in danger. In such times, careers are not built like in peacetime. They are forged under pressure. A wrong alliance can ruin you. A wrong sentence can end you. A wrong meeting can brand you. Sunday's advantage, his discipline, became his shield. He was learning how to live inside uncertainty without letting uncertainty live inside him. The clock kept ticking. Not the clock of old age yet, not the clock of death, but the clock of opportunity. If he didn't secure real influence before the next political shift, he could become one more forgotten name among thousands. If the rival reached the inner circle first, Sunday could be locked out permanently. So he took a risk. Not a reckless one, but a strategic risk. He positioned himself closer to the engines of decision-making, closer to where policy, appointments, and power were actually shaped. He stopped chasing the visible stage and moved toward the backstage controls. And right there, in the dimmer light, he discovered something that would define the rest of his life. The most powerful people are often not the ones on posters. They are the ones who manage access. The rival was still trying to win with applause. Sunday was learning how to win with doors. And as this first act closes, the tension tightens like a wire. A young nation is wobbling. Factions are hardening. The rules are unstable. And two ambitious men are moving toward the same prize. One is chasing the spotlight. The other is quietly becoming the person you call when the spotlight starts to burn. Sunday Awoniyi is not yet at the top, not even close. But he is no longer just a boy from 1932. He is now a player in a country that is about to test every political soul it has. And the next phase will demand something brutal. Not just ambition, not just intelligence, but the ability to stay standing when everyone around you starts falling. The strange thing about real power is that it doesn't look like power when you first walk into the room. It looks like bad lighting, tired furniture, overworked secretaries, and piles of files that nobody admits they're afraid of. Sunday. Awoniyi's first steps into that kind of room did not feel like a coronation. They felt like an exam. Somewhere behind those doors, men were deciding who would shape the future of northern Nigeria. On paper, Sunday was just a civil servant. Disciplined, reliable, nothing flashy. In reality, he was standing at the edge of a new life, one in which his signature on a document could change the direction of a region. But the window was narrow. A new wave of younger men was coming. A series of coups was approaching like a storm. If he didn't become indispensable fast, he would be one more name quietly retired before anyone learned to pronounce it properly. By the early 1960s, he had moved beyond the vague world of political involvement and into specific responsibility. He entered the Northern Regional Civil Service at a time when the region was the largest political unit in Nigeria. Sprawling, complicated, fragile. The premier, Sir Ahmadu Bello, needed people who were not just loyal, but efficient, calm, and unafraid of complexity. Sunday became one of those people. At first, it was routine work. Files, briefings, notes for meetings. Then the tasks became more delicate. Draft this speech, analyze that proposal. Summarize these tensions without causing panic. He was no longer just orbiting politics. He was feeding its bloodstream. The rival saw it and, for the first time, felt the sting of being outside the room when important things were said. The rival chose a different route into relevance. Where Sunday entered through service, the rival tried to burst through the front door of visibility. He attached himself to vocal politicians and charismatic figures, the kind who loved microphones and big promises. In the evenings, while Sunday was still in an office somewhere, laboring over a policy note, the rival was on a stage, his voice rising. Over cheers, his name repeated in crowded halls. People shook his hand and told him he was the future. It looked like Sunday had chosen the slow lane in a race that rewarded speed. Yet inside government buildings, something else was happening. Whenever a crisis needed clarity, whenever confusion threatened to derail a decision, someone would say, "Call Sunday. Let him look at it." That is how it begins for those who end up near the core of power. Not with trumpets, but with small, frighteningly important requests. One night, a file came to him bearing the premier's personal mark. It dealt with resource allocations, money, projects, priorities across a region, where every decision could ignite resentment. The instructions were simple: study, advise. Sunday stayed long after the building emptied, the silence around him thick, the clock on the wall speaking louder than any human voice. He knew what this meant. If his advice was timid, he would be ignored. If it was reckless, he could damage an entire region. If he got it right, though, he would move from being useful to being trusted, and trust in that world was power. When the premier read his analysis and quietly asked him to join a smaller, more confidential circle of advisors, it wasn't a promotion. It was an invisible crossing. Sunday began to see the mechanics behind the speeches, the arguments behind the public unity. He saw the worries they didn't show in public. Fears about secession, about opposition parties, about the military's growing restlessness. He watched how one wrongly timed statement could send an entire region into uproar. And he realized something chilling. The rival, with all his public glow, didn't know any of this. He was playing a game on the surface of the water, unaware of the currents below. For a brief moment, Sunday felt almost safe. Then history snapped that illusion in two. January 1966, Nigeria's first military coup. It was the kind of night that rewrites careers with bullets and fear. The premier, Sir Ahmadu Bello, was assassinated. The news moved like a shockwave through the northern establishment. Offices that had felt permanent suddenly looked like temporary structures in a storm. Sunday woke up into a new country where uniforms, not party symbols, now carried the final word. Files he had worked on for months no longer mattered. Projects died mid-sentence. Names disappeared from phone lists. Some of his colleagues never returned to their desks. Some fled, some were arrested, some were simply gone. In that chaos, his closeness to the old leadership could have destroyed him. The rival seemed for a moment to have gambled correctly. He had been courting military officers, even while praising civilian leaders, cultivating a reputation as someone who could work with anyone. In the new order, he appeared in the corridors again, smiling with an edge, shaking hands with men in khaki. When Sunday saw him one afternoon walking confidently beside a young military governor, it felt like a slap. The rival had not only survived the transition, he had pivoted, turning a moment of national shock into a personal shortcut. This was the nightmare version of their competition. Sunday's loyalty now looked like baggage, while the rival's flexibility looked like foresight. But the military men were not as naive as the rival believed. They trusted spectacle only to a point. When the dust of the coup began to settle, they faced a simple problem: how to run a massive, divided country with limited administrative experience. They needed people who understood the machinery of government. They needed people whose word could be relied upon, who did not panic, who did not turn every decision into a performance. It wasn't long before Sunday's name surfaced in conversations among officers who had never voted for anyone in their lives but now had to manage a civilian bureaucracy. They heard the same description repeated in different tongues: disciplined, detailed, and careful with power. So the twist arrived quietly. While the rival boasted about his access to the new rulers, Sunday was called in for something more serious. A senior military figure, blunt and pressed for time, told him plainly, "We need this region stabilized. We need people who are not politicians." It was both an opportunity and a trap. If Sunday refused, he would be sidelined. If he accepted and failed, he would be finished. If he accepted and succeeded, he would become something he had not exactly planned to be: a key operator in a military-dominated state. There was another layer of tension. This arrangement might not last. A counter-coup could come. A civil war could erupt. He had no guarantee of tomorrow. The window narrowed further when the country drifted toward open conflict. The late 1960s dragged Nigeria into a brutal civil war. While soldiers fought on battlefields, another kind of struggle took place in offices where Sunday spent his days: budgeting for war, and keeping basic services running, calming restless regions. He didn't carry a gun, but he carried documents that could mean life or death for communities. In emergency meetings, officers leaned over maps, while Sunday quietly laid out the logistical realities nobody wanted to hear. There's a different kind of fear in those rooms. The fear that a wrong assumption, a hastily signed order, could turn into a tragedy you will never fully see but always feel. The rival, meanwhile, tried to ride the war's chaos as a wave. He spoke loudly in favor of hard lines, of decisive action, of punishing opponents. It made him popular with some of the tougher voices in uniform. But war has a way of exposing empty bravado. At a critical moment, one of his aggressive recommendations backfired, leading to embarrassment for a high-ranking officer. The officer didn't shout, he simply stopped calling. In the architecture of power, that is how exile often begins. Your phone stops ringing. The rival felt the first chill of being outside again, while Sunday's quiet competence was becoming increasingly visible to exactly the people who mattered. In the middle of all this, the time pressure on Sunday became brutally clear. A younger generation of technocrats and ambitious officers was already forming just behind him. They had foreign degrees, new ideas, and little patience for those they considered old school, even if they were barely younger than him. Sunday understood that if he didn't transform himself from regional asset to national figure before Nigeria attempted another turn toward civilian rule, he would age out of the inner circle. He could already hear it in the way some people described him: experienced, steady. Words that can be compliments but also warnings that your prime may soon be declared over. So he accepted postings that dragged him deeper into the federal level, into ministries where policy for the entire country was shaped. As a permanent secretary and senior bureaucrat, he now sat near the engine of Nigeria's decision-making. The rooms changed: bigger tables, more accents, louder arguments, yet the core pattern remained. When meetings spun into emotion, someone would eventually turn to him and ask, "What is actually possible?" That is how his influence grew, not by dominating debates, but by calmly defining their limits. His memoranda began to circulate hand to hand, marked up, quoted, sometimes quietly resented because they forced reality into conversations fueled by ambition. Then came another twist. The rival returned, not as a loud outsider, but as a man who had learned the hard way that access can disappear. He approached Sunday with a proposal that sounded at first like reconciliation. The country was inching back toward thoughts of civilian governance. Parties would need organizers, strategists, people who could connect the military and the civilians. "We don't have to be enemies," the rival said. "We can form a bloc. You with your credibility, me with my networks." It was tempting. An alliance could accelerate Sunday's journey into the overt political layer of power, turning his backstage influence into visible authority. And time was not on his side. Every year, younger actors were sharpening their knives. Sunday said yes, but cautiously. He agreed to coordinate on certain initiatives, to support the formation of political structures, where his reputation for integrity could open doors and the rival's flair could fill rooms. For a short while it worked. Together they convinced skeptical stakeholders that a new civilian era could be more disciplined than the last, that the mistakes of early independence could be corrected. Sunday found himself speaking more, not just advising. He was no longer just the man behind the memo. He was stepping carefully toward the front of the stage. People who had only known him as that serious man from the ministry were now hearing his voice in public discussions. But the rival could not help himself. At a critical juncture, when key positions in the emerging political arrangement were being discussed, he moved faster, sharper, and more selfishly than anything he had admitted to Sunday. Using the credibility they had built together, he maneuvered to claim a top slot, one that external observers had quietly assumed would go to Sunday. It was an old pattern repeating itself in a new era. The rival smiling under bright lights, Sunday watching from the side as the applause went to another man. The betrayal was not just personal, it was strategic. Sunday realized that his deliberate pace, his reluctance to scramble publicly for titles, could still cost him power, even after all these years and all this trust. Yet the environment had changed since their early days. This time people noticed the gap between reputation and reward. In whispered conversations after conference sessions, in private dinners, in letters exchanged between influential figures, a theme emerged. Why is Sunday not in that position? Why do we keep rewarding the noisiest instead of the most serious? And the question itself became a form of power. It turned Sunday into something he had never aimed to be, a symbol of the tension between spectacle and substance in Nigerian public life. And symbols, even reluctant ones, are hard to erase. As Nigeria moved unevenly toward another attempt at civilian governance, Sunday stood at a dangerous crossroads. He had more influence than ever, but also more to lose. If he pushed too hard, he could be framed as a threat by both military men and ambitious civilians. If he stayed too cautious, the moment could pass him by forever, leaving him as a respected, irrelevant elder while others shaped the future. The clock, always ticking in the background of his life, now felt louder than ever. It wasn't just history moving quickly, it was his own age, his own finite energy, his own need to decide. Would he remain the man behind the decisions, or would he finally step fully into the visible, contested arena of national political power, knowing that his rival was already waiting there, smiling, ready for the next round? Power, he discovered, feels very different when it finally turns and looks you in the eye. For years, Sunday had watched it sideways, through memos and closed-door briefings, able to walk away at the end of the day and pretend. He was just a senior civil servant. But when Nigeria inched again toward civilian rule, there came a morning when that disguise stopped working. People no longer whispered, "Ask Sunday what he thinks." They said with a new, heavier tone, "Where is Sunday? We need him to decide." The spotlight he had avoided for decades swung onto his face, harsh, unforgiving. And standing just at the edge of that light, as always, was the rival, smiling, ready to claim that everything Sunday had built was only the prelude to his own performance. The transition clock was already ticking. Military rulers had given a timetable. Parties would be formed, constitutions debated, elections held. Dates were announced over the radio, the kind of dates that turn abstract politics into real deadlines. Sunday was no longer young. He knew this might be his last chance to shape the future openly, not just as a shadow in the background. Every day he hesitated. Younger men were rehearsing their speeches, printing posters, inventing slogans that could fit on a banner, even if they could not survive a budget. He walked into that moment not as an amateur, but as a man forged in the furnace of Nigeria's most turbulent decades. His years as a permanent secretary had taught him the brutal arithmetic of governance. He had seen what it meant to balance a national budget with the knowledge that a single careless cut could darken an entire town, close a school, or leave a hospital without medicine. He had watched the oil boom flood the treasury, then watched leaders act shocked when the tide went out. In meetings that stretched long into the night, he pushed, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, for discipline, warning that money spent without thought was not just waste. It was a future crisis wearing a party hat. Those years honed his reputation into something sharp enough to cut. Ministers came and went, swept in with one regime and out with the next. But Sunday remained in the machinery, the calm man with precise handwriting who remembered where yesterday's promises were buried. When new military rulers arrived, full of certainty and slogans about corrective government, they eventually ran into the same wall: reality. It was usually Sunday who quietly pointed out where the wall was. He helped shape policies on regional balance that tried, however imperfectly, to make millions of people feel they belonged to one country. He argued for merit without forgetting representation, for unity without pretending that grievances did not exist. The rival watched this steady accumulation of respect with growing impatience. Visibility, he had always believed, should be rewarded more than quiet work. So when the political space opened again, he sprinted. He joined committees with grand names, appeared in front of cameras after every meeting, spoke about vision and national rebirth in a tone that suggested he had personally invented the concepts. At public gatherings, people recognized him, slapped his back, asked for photos. Sunday, stepping cautiously into the same world, sometimes entered a hall where the rival had spoken an hour earlier and could feel the echo of his name still hanging in the air like smoke. But this time, Sunday was not content to be only the man behind the curtain. He helped shape one of the new broad-based parties that would later dominate Nigeria's democracy. He was in the rooms where founding documents were argued line by line, where the question was not just who will win the next election, but what kind of country will they inherit? He argued, sometimes to a chorus of rolling eyes, that internal discipline mattered, that if a party could not keep its own promises, and it had no moral right to ask the nation to trust it. Some tired of his insistence on rules. Others quietly began to rely on it. The deadlines sharpened everything. There were only so many months before the first major convention, only so many slots for key positions, only so much oxygen at the top. The rival understood that better than anyone. He launched a silent campaign, not in the streets, but in the luxury hotel lobbies where delegates and power brokers gathered late at night. There, over tea and whispered promises, he sold himself as the necessary balance to men like Sunday. He is honest, the rival would concede with a generous shrug. But politics is more than honesty. We need someone who can fight. It was clever, because it turned Sunday's greatest strength into an implied weakness. Sunday responded in his own way. He didn't trade envelopes, he traded trust. He went from state to state, not promising contracts or appointments, but invoking memory. He reminded older regional leaders of the days under Sir Ahmadu Bello, of a style of leadership that mixed authority with restraint. He spoke to younger politicians about the dangers of repeating the chaos that had destroyed the First Republic, of what it meant to lose democracy and wake up under a decree. His speeches were not fiery. They were controlled, almost severe. But in a country exhausted by shouting, some found the discipline refreshing. Inside the party, the struggle crystallized around a single battle. Who would control its moral compass? Titles like chairman or leader were names for something deeper. Who would decide when to use power and when to restrain it? Many assumed Sunday, with his long record and reputation for fairness, would naturally drift into that role. The rival saw that assumption and attacked it head-on. At the decisive convention, he moved with ruthless speed. Overnight, alliances shifted. Delegates who had promised Sunday their votes in private suddenly smiled apologetically and avoided his eyes on the floor. By the time the ballots were counted, the rival had secured a powerful position, one that would allow him to shape candidate lists and influence funding. It felt, for an instant, like a repeat of an old nightmare. Sunday's sober labor paving the way for someone else's triumph. Reporters noted the result as another episode in the familiar story of Nigerian politics, where the loudest often outmaneuver the most serious. But something had changed in the country and in Sunday himself. The people in the back of the hall, the bureaucrats, regional elders, and community leaders who had watched him for years, were not fooled by the headlines. They knew whose signature had been on the documents that made the convention possible, whose insistence on certain rules had prevented it from turning into a full spectacle of chaos. He chose not to leave in anger. Instead, he did something that surprised even his friends. He stepped further into public advocacy, beyond the confines of party structures. From the north, voices had been whispering for years about the need for a forum, a place where leaders could articulate regional concerns without tearing the country apart. Sunday became one of the midwives of that idea, helping to shape it into what would become a major northern consultative body. Where others wanted a pressure group that shouted, he insisted on something more dangerous, a platform that thought, a place where the North could speak loudly, yes, but also responsibly. When he eventually emerged as a central figure, later its chairman, it was not by orchestrated coronation, but by gravitational pull. People kept turning to him when debates inside the group threatened to fracture it along ethnic or religious lines. He argued that the North's strength lay not in retreating from Nigeria, but in insisting that Nigeria live up to its own promises. If this house collapses, he would say in meetings, it will not fall in sections. It will fall on all of us. Behind closed doors, he fought to prevent extreme voices from hijacking the platform, sometimes enduring accusations that he was too moderate, other times hearing the opposite charge from Southern critics, who saw any Northern coordination as a threat. The rival once again chose a different path. Seeing the rise of this Northern platform, he tried to ride it like a wave. He aligned himself closely with those who framed every national issue as an attack on their region, who wanted confrontation more than negotiation. It got him airtime. In moments of crisis, electoral violence, religious riots, he appeared on television, speaking with righteous fury, presenting himself as the uncompromising defender of his people. The danger which Sunday saw with growing alarm was that this posture threatened the fragile bridges that held the country together. Then came one of the sharpest tests of Sunday's career, the national push to amend the Constitution so that the sitting president could seek another term beyond the agreed limit. The proposal sliced through the country like a blade. Supporters spoke of continuity and stability. Opponents warned of a slow slide into lifelong rule. For Sunday, the issue was not just about one man, but about the meaning of a promise. After decades of coups and interrupted transitions, Nigeria had finally written down a clear boundary for executive power. To erase it now, he believed, would be to tell a whole generation that rules were always negotiable for the powerful. The time pressure became suffocating. Committees in the National Assembly scheduled hearings. Lobbying intensified. Bags of cash changed hands in dim corners. International observers watched nervously, sensing that the outcome would signal whether Africa's giant was finally learning to restrain itself. Sunday, already an elderly statesman, felt the weight of the years and the urgency of the moment pressing on his chest like a physical force. His doctors advised rest. Friends urged caution. You have done enough for this country. Let the younger ones fight this battle. He listened and then ignored them. He spoke out calmly but unmistakably against the extension of tenure. In interviews, he described the attempt as a betrayal, not of regions or parties, but of trust itself. In private strategy sessions, he counseled lawmakers to think beyond immediate benefits. If you break this lock today for a man you like, he told one, what will stop another man you fear from using the same broken door tomorrow? The rival, sensing an opportunity, moved decisively in the opposite direction. He aligned himself with those pushing for the amendment, presenting it as a strategic necessity for his region, a chance to extract more concessions from a grateful president. For a while, it looked as if the rival had read the room correctly. The presidency's influence was everywhere, on the phone, in quiet visits, in sudden favors granted. Rumors flew that even men long thought incorruptible were wavering, their names penciled into secret lists of likely supporters. Sunday heard his own name mentioned in those lists by ignorant commentators and felt a cold anger rise. He doubled down, not with rage, but with clarity. He summoned what little energy his aging body still stored and attended crucial gatherings, his frail frame wrapped in traditional robes that seemed to hang heavier on his shoulders than before. When he spoke, some were startled by how sharp his words still were. Then the twist arrived, not with gunfire or a dramatic televised announcement, but with votes quietly cast in the legislature. The amendment failed. The attempt to stretch the Constitution snapped instead. Across the country, people exhaled a breath they had not realized they were holding. In the North, in the South, in cities and in villages, there was a sense, fleeting but real, that something important had been defended. Sunday did not dance. He did not organize victory rallies. He simply sat in his home listening to the news, his fingers steepled, eyes closed, and allowed himself a rare, private smile. For the rival, the outcome was brutal. Those who had pushed hardest for the extension suddenly found themselves exposed. Their speeches aged badly overnight. Their promises, once framed as visionary, now read like endorsements of illegality. Phones that had rung constantly went silent. Invitations dried up. A few men attempted frantic rebranding, insisting they had merely explored the idea without ever really supporting it. But the country had been watching, and memory, once awakened, is not easily fooled. Sunday's stature, on the other hand, shifted into a different category. He was no longer just the respected administrator, the careful advisor, the northern elder with good handwriting and a long memory. He became, in the eyes of many, a benchmark. The question in certain gatherings changed from, is this legal? To would someone like Sunday stand for this? That kind of influence is deeper than office. It does not come with a motorcade, but it outlives one. And yet, for all the symbolic victories, the clock did not stop. Nigeria's problems remained massive. Corruption that ate through budgets like acid, infrastructure that collapsed faster than it was, repaired young people whose only view of the state was of uniforms demanding bribes at checkpoints. In the North, old wounds over poverty and marginalization mixed with new anger and, soon enough, new forms of violence. Sunday, as chairman and voice of Northern interest, found himself constantly walking a line so thin it felt like a wire over a canyon. He had to speak strongly enough to be heard by his own people, but carefully enough not to feed the fires already burning in fragile towns. Morning by morning, the time pressure shifted from national calendars to his own body. He woke earlier, not because he slept well, he rarely did, but because he knew the day's work needed every hour he could give it. His aides watched him move more slowly, pausing at staircases, leaning a little heavier on the arm of a chair when he stood. But in meetings, the old intensity flashed. A sloppy argument, a conveniently vague statistic, a lazy excuse for failure. These still annoyed him into sharpness. The rival, older now too, lingered around the edges of relevance like a man waiting for another train that might never arrive. He still appeared at events, still issued statements, still had loyalists who defended him loudly. But the center of gravity had shifted. In a cruel irony, he now sometimes invoked Sunday's name in his own speeches, trying to borrow the credibility of the man he had spent a lifetime competing against. History, indifferent as always, recorded the contrast without comment. As Nigeria's fragile democracy stumbled from crisis to crisis, Sunday moved through its corridors with the awareness that he was running. A race he could not win, only prolong, a race against the exhaustion of a country and against the limits of his own heart and bones. There were files on his desk he knew he would not finish, conversations he suspected would be his last on certain subjects. Yet he kept saying yes to one more meeting, one more intervention, one more attempt to keep the balance from tipping over. Somewhere not far ahead, though he could not yet see its exact shape, lay the moment when his body would finally enforce the limits that politics never had. And when that moment came, the question would remain hanging over everything he had done. In a nation that often rewards the loud and the ruthless, what does it mean that one of its most enduring figures had built his influence on something as unfashionable and as fragile as principle? The strangest thing about becoming a national conscience is that the nation assumes you no longer age. As Nigeria stumbled from one crisis to the next, people spoke of Sunday Awoniyi as if he were a permanent fixture, like the Rocky Hills outside Abuja, or the Harmattan dust that returned every year uninvited. Call Sunday, they would say, as casually as if he lived in the next street, not in a fragile body held together by old scars and sheer will. On television, his calm, measured voice gave the illusion of stability. Off-screen, his doctors quietly adjusted his medication and reminded him, in the cautious language of professionals, that even the strongest conscience still beats inside a mortal heart. He heard them. He nodded politely. And then he reached for his diary again. There was no shortage of pages to fill. The years after the failed third-term bid did not bring the rest many had promised. If anything, they tightened the screws. New elections loomed, new alliances formed and dissolved overnight. In the North, governors and senators jostled for influence, careful to wrap their ambitions in the language of regional interest. Southern politicians watched the Arewa Consultative Forum with a mix of suspicion and nervous respect, trying to guess whether the next statement from Kaduna would calm the waters or send a fresh wave crashing over Abuja. In the middle of all this stood Sunday, no longer young, but still the axis around which certain arguments turned. His phone did not respect time zones or sleep. Midnight calls from governors who needed advice but would never admit it publicly. Early morning visits from journalists, hoping for a quote that could anchor a front-page story. Delegations from small towns, traveling all night in crowded buses, arriving at his gate with petitions, complaints, and occasionally simple gratitude. Every request seemed to carry the same hidden urgency. Come, before it is too late. He felt another deeper deadline underneath all these smaller ones. It was not written in any party timetable or election calendar. It ticked silently in his chest. Some mornings, when he rose too quickly, the room tilted for a moment and then righted itself. He would pause, one hand on the back of the chair, and think, so, that is how it begins. Then he would straighten, adjust his glasses, and walk out to another day of persuading people that patience and restraint were not signs of weakness. The rival knew how to use time differently. He could smell the fatigue in the air. Not just Sundays, but the country's. To a nation impatient for quick, dramatic answers, moderation began to feel like delay, and delay felt like betrayal. The rival leaned into that sentiment with practiced ease. At rallies and in interviews, he framed the coming years as a decisive battle for the soul of the North, a struggle that, he implied, required a more combative style than what elders like Sunday could offer. It is not enough to speak good English and quote the Constitution, he would say with a mocking smile that never quite reached his eyes. We must be ready to protect our people by any means necessary. The phrase by any means necessary traveled quickly. On radio phone-in shows, callers repeated it with approval. In the markets and motor parks, young men nodded along, tired of hearing about conferences and communiques that seemed to change nothing in their daily lives. The rival posed for photographs, surrounded by youths in party t-shirts, his hand raised, his teeth gleaming. It was the kind of image Sunday had never cared to cultivate, and now, late in life, could never have replicated even if he wanted to. Yet when real fires broke out, when violence threatened to spill past the limits of news headlines and into the fragile homes of ordinary people, there was a difference between who generated heat and who actually knew how to lower the temperature. In those moments, the same politicians who cheered the rivals' hard talk often reached quietly for Sunday's number. One such crisis came with frightening speed. A disputed election result in a northern state set off protests that boiled into riots. Churches were burned, mosques vandalized in retaliation. Rumors flew faster than any official statement could catch up with them. Text messages, heavy with rage and half-truths, turned whole districts into echo chambers of fear. In the middle of that chaos, Sunday chaired a tense meeting in Kaduna. Governors, traditional rulers, security chiefs. They gathered around a long table littered with bottled water, sweating in the stale air. The rival's voice, as usual, was not far away. He had already appeared on television, condemning the violence, but with enough pointed accusations to ensure that blame fell squarely on political opponents, rather than on the culture of impunity he himself had helped to feed. Inside the room, Sunday listened to the shouting. This governor blamed that party. That senator accused this ethnic group. Someone demanded immediate military action. Another warned that soldiers would inflame the situation. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, mocking their helplessness. For nearly an hour, the meeting went in circles, anger chasing fear around the table. Finally, Sunday cleared his throat. The noise did not stop instantly, but it faltered. Heads turned toward him. He began gently, almost conversationally, asking simple questions that cut deeper than any long speech. "Governor," he said to one, "how many people have actually died?" "Not rumors, real numbers." The man fumbled with papers, embarrassed, forced to admit that he did not yet know. "Security chief," Sunday continued, "how many of your men are on the streets right now, and how many are still waiting for orders?" The officer shifted in his seat, aware that the evasion he used in press briefings would not survive here. Piece by piece, Sunday stripped away exaggerations and excuses until the bare, ugly facts lay on the table. Then, he did something that surprised some of the younger men present. He took responsibility not for the violence itself, but for the leadership vacuum that had allowed it to grow. "We in this room," he said quietly, "have spent too much time talking at microphones and not enough time talking to the people who actually set the tires on fire. We speak English, they speak hunger. We speak law, they speak resentment. If we do not learn their language, they will destroy this house, while we are still arguing about who owns the land." There was a long silence. It was not defeat, it was acknowledgement. Plans made in that room, visits to affected neighborhoods, joint statements by religious leaders, compensation for victims, would not magically erase the damage. But they slowed the fire. In the days that followed, reporters noted that the Arua Consultative Forum had once again acted as a stabilizing force. They mentioned Sunday's name, but only briefly, as if his role were expected, almost routine. The rival, watching the same news, ground his teeth in private. He tried a different attack. If he could not outmoral Sunday, he would try to outmodern him. At a high-profile gathering in Abuja, he delivered a speech that was really a challenge wrapped in polite language. He praised Sunday's historic contributions and fatherly guidance, then asked with the air of someone merely posing a theoretical question whether our generation is not perhaps over-reliant on elders, to the point that we delay necessary changes. The implication was clear. Sunday and men like him were bottlenecks, respected relics blocking the path to a more dynamic, aggressive North. Cameras captured the polite smiles around the hall. They did not capture the flicker that passed through Sunday's eyes. Later, away from the podium lights, a young journalist approached Sunday, recorder in hand, clearly nervous. "Sir," he began, "how do you respond to suggestions that perhaps your generation should step aside more quickly?" Sunday could have dismissed the question. Instead, he gave the kind of answer that would outlive the news cycle. "Step aside for whom?" he asked calmly. "For the loudest or for the most prepared? My son, leadership is not like a relay race where you pass the baton to whoever shouts, 'Hand it to me,' the loudest. It is surgery on a living body. You do not put the knife into just any hand because the patient is tired of waiting." He paused, then allowed himself a faint smile. "When I find enough younger men and women who are ready to put principle above convenience, I will gladly step aside. In fact, I pray that day comes soon. My knees are not as young as my conscience." There was humor in the line, but also something else, an admission that he was searching urgently for successors he could trust. That became his quiet project in those final years, spotting, testing, and encouraging younger leaders who showed signs of the stubborn integrity he valued. He invited them to his home, not for large public meetings, but for long conversations that ran on into the night. He told them stories of Sir Ahmadu Bello, not the polished legends, but the difficult moments, the mistakes, the doubts. He described budgets that had nearly broken him, decisions that still hurt when he remembered them. "Do not admire me," he told one wide-eyed politician in his 30s. "Learn from my fear. Every time we touch the machinery of the state, we are close to destroying someone's life without even seeing their face. If that thought ever stops disturbing your sleep, leave politics immediately. You have become dangerous." Those meetings did not make headlines. They did not trend on any platform. But years later, some of those young men and women would speak of them as turning points, nights when politics shifted in their minds, from a contest for posts to a burden they might or might not be worthy to carry. Time, however, remained unmoved by his efforts. Even as he tried to stretch his remaining years to fit in as much mentoring and mediation as possible, his body sent stronger warnings. A chest pain here, a sudden wave of exhaustion there. His doctors became less diplomatic. "You must reduce your travel," one insisted, tapping a finger on the file. "Road journeys especially. These long trips, the stress, the bad roads, they are not for you anymore, sir." He nodded, promised to be careful, and meant it. For a while, he canceled some engagements, sent written messages instead of appearing in person. His aides breathed easier. But politics has a way of manufacturing emergencies, and in 2007, one arrived that he felt he could not ignore. The ruling party was deep into another season of succession dramas. Zoning agreements, informal understandings about which region would produce the next president, were being whispered and argued over. In corridors and hotel suites, in the north, the mood oscillated between entitlement and anxiety. Some believed it was their turn and treated that belief as a guarantee. Others feared that, once again, clever maneuvers in Abuja would leave them watching from the sidelines while the music played. A crucial meeting was called in Kaduna, a gathering of northern leaders, both political and traditional, to hammer out a common position before decisions in the capital hardened into fact. The date was fixed. The agenda circulated. Sunday's presence, everyone agreed, was essential. He tried briefly to imagine sending a representative. Then he looked at the papers spread across his desk, memos, letters, draft resolutions, and knew that this was one conversation he had to attend himself. "If we miss this window," he told a worried friend, "we will spend the next 8 years complaining about an outcome we did nothing to shape. I cannot sit in Abuja and watch that happen." The rival saw the opportunity too. He planned to attend, flanked by loyalists, eager to present himself as the more vigorous, more future-oriented voice of the North. In private, he scoffed at concerns about Sunday's health. "If the old man cannot handle the journey," he said with a shrug that was anything but sympathetic, "perhaps that is God's way of telling him to rest." Dawn on the Abuja-Kaduna road looked almost gentle that morning. The sky was a soft gray, the kind that makes headlights seem brighter than they are. Sunday climbed into the car with the careful movements of a man aware of every bone in his body. His aides fussed over seatbelts, temperature settings, the flask of tea they had prepared. He smiled, thanked them, and settled in, holding a slim file on his lap. Notes for the meeting, names he wanted to remember, points he needed to emphasize. The road was one he had traveled countless times. Its dangers were no secret. Reckless drivers, heavy trucks, sudden potholes where smooth tarmac had been yesterday. But to men who had spent their careers crossing Nigeria by air and road, risk had become background noise, like the hum of a generator. Accidents were statistics on the evening news, tragedies that happened to unnamed others. Somewhere along that road, routine shattered. The accounts that later circulated differed in small details, as they always do. Some said a speeding vehicle tried to overtake and misjudged the distance. Others blamed a blown tire, a moment's distraction, a patch of bad asphalt. What everyone agreed on was the sound. A brutal, metallic impact, the kind that silences conversation mid-sentence and turns glass into a spray of tiny, lethal stars. Inside the crushed vehicle, time did something strange. For Sunday, there was no dramatic slow motion, no cinematic review of his life. There was confusion, pain, and then an overwhelming heaviness, as if the world had suddenly become too dense to move through. Voices shouted outside. Hands fumbled with twisted doors. Someone cried out his name over and over, as if repetition could force his eyes to stay open. News of the accident traveled faster than the ambulance. Phones rang in Kaduna, Abuja, and far beyond. For a few hours, the nation held its breath in that peculiar space between hope and dread. Official statements urged calm. Family members rushed to the hospital. their faces stiff with the effort of believing the most optimistic version of events. He was stabilized, then flown out, as important men so often are, to a hospital in London where machines surrounded him with their impersonal competence. In Nigeria, the headlines carried careful phrases, "In critical condition, receiving the best medical attention, we urge Nigerians to pray." The rival issued a statement expressing concern and wishing him a speedy recovery. The words smooth, correctly arranged, and entirely insufficient. Days passed in that suspended state. For those who had leaned on his voice for so long, it was almost impossible to imagine a Nigeria where they could not pick up a phone or arrange a visit to hear his unvarnished assessment of their latest bright ideas. In mosques and churches, prayers included his name. In political gatherings, men spoke of him in the present tense, then caught themselves, as if the grammatical slip might tempt fate. On November 28, 2007, the deadline his body had been quietly announcing for years finally arrived. Machines continued to hum, lights continued to blink, but somewhere beneath all the technology, a tired heart decided it had negotiated enough extensions. The news, when it came, was both expected and unbearable. In Abuja, officials prepared formal tributes. In Kaduna, the Arewa Consultative Forum issued statements heavy with respect and loss. In Mopa, his hometown, the news struck with a different force. There, he was not just the elder statesman, the Sardauna Karemi, the man whose carefully chosen words could sway a national debate. He was the boy who had left and returned, the son of the soil whose name had carried their small town into conversations far beyond Kogi State. Television screens filled with images from his life, black and white photographs of a younger Sunday in well-cut suits, grainy footage of him sitting behind ministers during the early years of Northern administration, later clips of him in flowing traditional robes, speaking slowly, his hands moving only when absolutely necessary. Commentators spoke of his principled stand, his uncompromising integrity, his rare courage in a system that often punishes honesty. Some of the same mouths that had once complained about his stubbornness now elevated it to legend. The rival watched these tributes with an expression that even close associates struggled to read. He attended the funeral, of course. How could he not? Cameras captured him among the mourners, head bowed, face arranged into public sorrow. In private conversations later, he insisted that whatever their differences, he had always respected Sunday's dedication to the North. But history has a cruel way of arranging contrasts. In the weeks and months after Sunday's death, as new battles erupted over constitutional interpretation, party discipline, and regional equity, journalists began to notice a pattern. In arguments over what Nigeria should or should not do, people invoked Sunday's name as a reference point, a kind of moral yardstick. This proposal, they would say, is something Sunday would have rejected outright. Or let us be guided by the kind of Nigeria Sunday envisioned. They did not notably use the rival's name that way. Within the Arewa Consultative Forum, the scramble to fill the gap he left behind was intense. Some argued that the organization needed a tougher, more openly confrontational posture, in a country where, they claimed, subtlety was mistaken for weakness. Others warned that abandoning Sunday's style would turn the forum into just another echo chamber of anger. Behind closed doors, voices rose. At one particularly heated meeting, someone suggested that perhaps the rival, with his energy and visibility, should be considered for a leading role. The idea died in the air. It was not shouted down. It simply failed to draw oxygen. People shifted in their seats, avoided eye contact, let the suggestion hang for a moment, and then fall silently to the floor. Whatever criticisms they might have had of Sunday in life, his death had clarified something. The North did not just need a loud advocate, it needed a conscience, and even his fiercest opponent did not quite fit that shape. Years slid by, as they always do. New administrations came and went. New crises introduced themselves with the same old arrogance. A generation of young Nigerians grew up knowing Sunday Awoniyi not as a man they could call, but as a name attached to streets, lecture, halls, and occasional documentaries. In universities, political science students studied his memos and speeches as examples of bureaucratic clarity and moral stubbornness. In law schools, debates about constitutional amendments sometimes turned on what leaders like Sunday would have tolerated. In quiet moments, long after cameras had moved on to fresher faces, some of his former colleagues admitted a truth they had never quite voiced while he lived. It was easier to be reckless when he was not in the room. When he was there, sitting straight, glasses low on his nose, asking simple, precise questions, certain shortcuts felt more dangerous. A certain lies harder to tell. Without that presence, temptation grew. And yet the example he left behind had a strange, delayed power. Those younger politicians he had pulled aside for private conversations began to rise. A governor here, a senator there, a party official in some committee that most of the country would never hear about. In moments of pressure, when envelopes appeared on tables or when the party whip leaned in with a friendly reminder, some of them heard faintly his voice. If you break this lock today for a man you like, what will stop another man you fear from using the same broken door tomorrow? Not all of them resisted. Nigeria did not suddenly become a country of saints, but enough did that, in small, often invisible ways, the slope tilted slightly away from the abyss he had spent his life warning about. As for the rival, time rendered its own verdict. He retained followers, influence, airtime. He continued to speak in the language of urgency and threat, promising to defend his people against every real or imagined slight. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the center of gravity shifted around him. The country, scarred and tired, began to show a different kind of hunger, not just for leaders who could shout, but for those who could stand still, resist the rush, and say no when saying yes would be easier. In that emerging hunger, Sunday's absence became a presence of its own. He had not built a movement bearing his name. He had not minted a political dynasty or installed himself in an office that passed neatly from father to son. What he left behind was less tangible and therefore more difficult to destroy. A memory of how power can be held without being worshipped. Of how a man from a small town in Kogi State could sit in rooms where the fate of millions was decided and still worry, genuinely, about whether a hospital in a distant village had enough medicine. On some future day when Nigeria once again finds itself at a dangerous fork, facing the seductive logic of just this once that has undone so many nations, someone will mention him in a meeting or in a newspaper column, or over a cramped dinner table where politics is argued with more passion than food. They will not quote him perfectly. They will not remember every detail of his career, but they will recall, dimly but insistently, that there was once a man who treated rules not as obstacles but as promises, who saw deadlines not just on paper but in the faces of ordinary people who could not afford one more bad decision. And in that moment, in the quiet space between temptation and choice, Sunday Awoniyi will still be negotiating with the living, insisting, as he always did, that principle may be fragile, but it is the only thing strong enough to outlast the noise.